Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all at our Pariser Platz seminar, the last meeting before the summer, this time in English. My name is Mateusz Fałkowski. I'm deputy head of the Pilecki-Institut Berlin. And we'll be discussing today quite a fascinating topic of displaced Polish people in post-war Germany, in British occupied zone. And our speaker is Dr. Samantha Knapton of the University of East Anglia, and she's an expert on this topic. So the title of her talk is Brothers in Arms, with question mark, so we don't know yet, yes? So, Polish displaced persons in British occupied Germany 1945-1951. And this talk will be commented by Dr. Markus Nesselrodt of Europa-Universität Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. And after the talk and the comment and the response to this comment, so we will be open also for questions from our audience. I introduce our participants, our speakers. Samantha Knapton received her PhD from Newcastle University and has been working at the University of East Anglia since 2018. And she's author of the monograph Occupiers, Humanitarian Workers and Polish Displaced Persons in British Occupied Germany. And this book is forthcoming this year, next year?
One of the two, yes.
Okay.
They haven't specified.
And Samantha is also the co-editor of the volume on UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Program of the United Nations for a post-war world, humanitarian intervention and the UNRWA. And this book will be published next year. Okay. So, and currently, Samantha is a junior research fellow at the Pilecki-Institut in Warsaw and a scholarship holder in Warsaw. And her project is focused on Anglo-Polish attempts to encourage repatriation through invoking interwar concepts of Polishness and post-war ideas concerning nation building. And Markus Nesselrodt is also historian, and his main research areas are Polish and Russian history from 18th to the 20th century, so it's a quite a long span of time. So city history, Jewish history in Central and Eastern Europe, and history of flight and migration. He's in the context of this particular meeting, of this particular seminar, it's important that he's an author or co-editor of a volume on displaced person research, on displaced persons, research conducted in Germany and Austria. So we have on board two representatives of the maybe, I don't know, so maybe two different research traditions, approaches. I don't know. Maybe it's only one, but maybe this is question to you after this at the end of this meeting. And Markus is also author of the monography of Polish Jews in the Soviet Union during the Second World War in years 1939-1946, and this book was published in 2019. And now I would like to ask Samantha for maybe one question. So very short question. So. This Brothers in Arms, once again, so this is, you are a fan of Dire Straits, or no?
I mean, I don't mind the Dire Straits, but this definitely isn't related to that whatsoever. Should I begin? Okay, can everyone hear me okay? I've not really used a microphone before in my life, so this is interesting. I just want to thank the Pilecki-Institut for inviting me here to actually do this talk. It's very, very nice of them, and also to Dr. Markus Nesselrodt, who's taken his time to actually read some of my work, bless him, and it turned up to actually speak about it. So I didn't really know at what level I was going to pitch this, so my hope is that if you know absolutely nothing about displaced persons in the post-war period, you're at least going to come away with something to do with that. But my plan is for the first half hour to really talk about my book, what that involved, what kind of source base I used and why it's important. And then I'm going to talk about how, or what I'm doing at the Pilecki-Institut at the minute, because I've been in Warsaw since April this year. So, very simplistic second slide. What is my research? This is a very simple slide, but it actually says everything that you need to know. So I look at Anglo-Polish and German relations in the immediate post-war period. And if you think of it in a very Matryoshka doll style fashion, I look at Polish displaced persons within the British zone of occupation in occupied Germany under the banner of international humanitarianism. And that's what that symbol is on the left-hand side. It's the insignia for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA. So UNRWA actually predated the United Nations. It came into existence in 1943, and it developed into something called the International Refugee Organization before it eventually became the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which we all know and love today. So my research really focuses on all of these aspects together, because looking at them individually doesn't really tell us much about the post-war story. I've gone into the displaced persons camps because I was very tired of hearing about stories that are from a very institutional level without actually getting the experiences of what's going on in the camps. That in itself poses a number of problems when you try and get the very on-the-ground perspective. So the slide is how I do this, and that is actually, oh, it got louder. That's actually the front cover of my book, incredibly exciting as it is. And it's going to, as Mateusz said, it's occupiers, humanitarian workers, and Polish displaced persons in British occupied Germany, which I'm assured by my publishers is a very Googleable title. And the way that I actually do my work is I use the voices of those in the middle. So I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So if I'm working with sources in British occupied Germany, I use the British Army of the Rhine, I use Foreign Office records, Allied Control Council records, and of course the records from UNRWA itself, so the United Nations records. These are all very heavy, top-down sorts of records, and more often than not, when it comes to displaced persons camps, all they're doing is dictating policy. So, as we all know, from having worked in institutions throughout our lives, or just for companies in general, whatever the policy is at the top, when they try to institute it, in reality, it doesn't normally go the way that they want it to. And that's because situations on the ground change how that policy is instituted. So when people only look at the things that are at the top, they're getting an idea of what the perfect version of a policy is, but not actually how it played out. So I take all of these, and then I also go, and sorry about this very visual hierarchy, but I also try and get the voices from those at the bottom, which is the displaced persons themselves. So in the post-war period, and I'll give you a little overview of how many people we're talking about and the situation in a minute, but by and large, Polish displaced persons in the aftermath of the Second World War did not sit down and start writing memoirs. Apart from just the inability to do that because of mental capacity, exhaustion, there was just a very big problem with actually gathering materials to be able to do that. The paper needed, the pens. So we don't really have those sorts of sources. We have a few now and then. We have many memoirs that might have been put together 30 years later, but then we have issues with memory. But what we do have is a vast amount of what we call material culture. So paintings, photographs. My favorite things to use are cartoons, political cartoons in particular, and just little drawings. So sometimes they're only tiny little cartoons, but there's also things like embroidery, stitching, songs and poems. So all of these things that we would associate with how a culture really interacts with each other. And the beauty of these sources is as well, is that they're generally created at a specific point in time because they're reacting to something. So if we've got the policies from up above and we've got the ones from below at the same time, we can see what policy has been instituted and what that reaction is through these sort of creative materials. And then come the voices in the middle. And they belong to the UNRWA welfare workers and military officials in the camps. So now, in the immediate aftermath, I don't know how much people know, but UNRWA was meant to take over displaced persons camps in their entirety. But as one military man said, the war had taken the best and the brightest. So because UNRWA was actually set up during wartime, they were left with quite a few people who just weren't physically capable of going to war, or lacked the will to go to war, or had been on the home front for some time. So it wasn't exactly like they were getting, in the nicest possible way, the cream of the crop. So when they went into the camps, they also didn't have the numbers they needed to look after those who were displaced. So they had to rely on the military, and that was never the plan. It was always meant to be just UNRWA. But they were so understaffed that the military had to stay there for the duration of the UNRWA camps, which lasted until 1947. Okay, that's better. Ooh, surround sound. Okay, so in May 1945, there was roughly 7 million displaced persons in the 3 western zones of occupation, which is the British, French, and American zones. There was also thought to be a similar number in the Eastern Zone or the Soviet Zone. However, officially, there were no such things as Soviet displaced persons. So they were not allowed to get UNRWA care because the Soviets didn't buy into the UNRWA framework. So I'm talking about United Nations displaced persons when I mention displaced persons. So as you can see, the numbers changed drastically between May and September 1945. So by September 1945, there's 1.2 million remaining in the 3 western zones. What's happened to the other 6 million? Well, a lot of them were these Soviet quote-unquote displaced persons that got sent back to the east, and many of the others were Western displaced persons. So Italians, Dutch, French. And it was basically agreed by the big 3, so Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta, that Western and Soviet displaced persons would be given priority for repatriation. And many scholars have basically contended that because of that, and keep in mind there is a large amount of Polish displaced persons in all 3 zones of occupied Germany, all 3 Western zones, they were halted from being able to actually repatriate in the first few months at the end of the war. They were stopped until September. And if anyone knows Polish history, quite a lot happened between May and September 1945 that made a lot of them think twice about returning home. There was the change in government. There was also the change in borders. So what those voices do in the middle that I've been talking about, the welfare workers that I've been talking about, is they give us a very real insight into how people reacted to the news that even things like the borders had changed. And then we've got this vast amount of Polish displaced persons in the British zone. So out of the 1.2 million remaining, about half are in the British zone, 640,000. And of that 640,000, 510,000 are Polish displaced persons. So when things go wrong with Polish displaced persons in the British zone, it's the majority of their DP population. It counts for 79% of the overall British zone's population. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. And then we've got lovely little pictures going on here. I'm just going to talk about 4 main aspects of the book. And the first one is really about the Anglo-Polish relationship and its breakdown. So I'm from England, to state the obvious. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about some very big master narratives. So in the UK, generally, if you meet someone who's not done a history degree and you ask them what the relationship between Britain and Poland is, they'll bring up a few things. The first one is that Britain declared war on Germany in defense of Poland. The second one is that they might know that they housed the Polish government in exile in London. And the third one is that they took in Poles in the aftermath of the Second World War. They generally don't know that they're ex-army members. They just think that they helped displaced persons. But one of the major issues is, and this is why the name of the talk was Brothers in Arms, is there was this rhetoric within the displaced persons camps themselves, but also in the wider British public, that Poles and Brits were brothers in arms. And that has a very specific connotation. So it was meant to tie those Poles who were part of the army and fought alongside the British army, literally brothers in arms, as in munitions. But what actually happened in the displaced persons camps in that intermittent period when they weren't allowed to repatriate is a lot of ex-army members were touring the camps, people like Anders, for instance, but also not as famous as Anders, and going around and talking about how Britain and Poland are really good friends and therefore we're brothers in arms and we won't Like, there will be no breakdown in relationship because we're so close. The problem is, from the British side of things, they would only really thought that they were going to take on Poles who were part of the army and not the displaced persons themselves. So, for instance, my PhD, the original title was called A Troublesome Nuisance, because this was a title that came up quite a lot when this fella got involved. So this is Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan. He became the chief for the UNRWA missions operation in Germany for the entirety of the 3 Western zones. And he often complained about Polish displaced persons not understanding that all they need to do is just go back home. But on the flip side, a lot of the military officials and welfare workers didn't have a clue what Poland even was at that point. They didn't understand why the change in borders mattered. And quite often they couldn't identify who was actually Polish, which is the next problem we have. But within the camps themselves, because we have UNRWA and we've got the military, what we found very quickly is that the military, even though there was the non-fraternization order in place between the British and the German military, the British military were very quickly striking up friendships and relationships with ex-army German members and just German people who were working in the displaced persons camps. As I said, they were very understaffed, so they started hiring Germans from the surrounding area, but then continuing to treat Polish displaced persons as if they were a troublesome nuisance. And this memorandum, it's from September or October 1945, and I'm just going to read it out and then comment on it a bit. So it says, a general study of the Polish problem in the British zone during the last 2 months leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that there is a lack of understanding of this question, both by the British and by the Poles. The question is just, why are they still here? What are we doing with the Poles? So though certain Polish elements are frequently at fault, it would appear that all Poles, regarded by many of the British troops as a nuisance. Few attempts have been made to put the psychological aspect of the Polish case to the British soldier, nor is the attitude of the British press very helpful. Tactless handling of the situation leads to resentment among the Poles themselves. When this resentment assumes active proportions, the British authorities naturally take measures, whether forcible or otherwise, to maintain or restore order. This leads to further discontent, and so the vicious circle grows. So, when I was doing my research, I was basically looking at those top-down policies, the reactions from those in the middle who are reacting to those policies from above, but also reacting to the displaced person's reactions. So they've actually recorded them. So what I have is a whole treasure trove, if you will, of sources that give us the at-the-moment reactions. I mean, of course, some could have been doctored or altered a little bit later on, but by and large, there is a whole tranche that we've identified that can definitely be put at an exact time when these policies are kind of put into place and show the reactions to them. And one of the major issues is because there was so many British military members within the camps themselves, is that they just kind of thought, in a very simple way, I've just fought a war, I want to go home, I'm tired, why don't these people also go home? And there was just no attempt to actually get an understanding across as to why there was this rejection of repatriation, which kind of brings us to the second sort of question. Oh, who was really Polish is what that said. So who was really Polish? And the first ever conference I did when I was doing my PhD, someone asked me this question and I was like, that's very interesting. I wrote a paragraph on it in my PhD. That paragraph turned into 15,000 words. And then in the book, it's now 2 chapters. And it doesn't just look at, like very objectively who was Polish in 1945. It's looking at it from 2 very different viewpoints. One of them is a case study of 2 very big Polish camps in the British zone of occupation, and the other one is who's British to the Polish at this time and how does that alter how they treat them. So what I've given you here is just it's drawings and doodlings from an UNRWA welfare worker's diary. So this is one of my favorite UNRWA welfare workers called Rhoda Dawson. Her diary is available at the Imperial War Museum. And you can see that she obviously got quite bored during her training because she decided to doodle the trainer themselves. And then on the right-hand side, it says that they need the whole assembly center to start to smell like liberty. So I'm assuming this trainer was American because I don't think that would happen in a British training center. But the thing that you need to look at is on the bottom. So it says that Eastern Poles may, if let free by Soviet, opt for West Poland. If Russian liaison officer decides that an Eastern Pole is a Soviet citizen, he must go back. So this is the training that UNRWA welfare workers are getting given and then getting sent into displaced persons camps. So they're basically saying if you're a Pole that used to live east of the River Bug, you're Soviet. And because the Soviets were put under forcible repatriation, big issues start appearing. And on top of it all off, this is the language training that they were given. That was it. That's the entirety of Rhoda Dawson's Polish language training. And she ended up in the American zone of occupation. It's an attempt to phonetically spell some of the letters that we don't have in the English alphabet. And she ended up in a displaced persons camp in the American zone that had 20,000 Polish displaced persons. It was the biggest Polish displaced persons camp, called Wildflecken. And this is how she had to try and communicate that. If you think about it as well, UNRWA was an international organization. It was made up from people from Britain and America, but also all over the world. They had no idea why geography in Europe and Central Europe and Eastern Europe mattered. They also didn't understand the language. So when you come across a lot of the displaced persons cards and it says location or place of birth, it says Tutaisi or Tutai. And the UNRWA workers have gone, that sounds interesting, and written it down. And it just means I'm from here. That's all it means. So when you're trying to then place these displaced persons into different camps, it becomes even more complicated. Probably should have clarified that when the Allies started grouping all the displaced persons together, they decided they needed a way to group them. So they put them in displaced persons camps according to perceived ethnicity or nationality. But it was normally self-declared ethnicity or nationality. So you would have camps that were entirely Polish, camps that were entirely Ukrainian, so on and so forth. So if you can't actually distinguish who was Polish or how to even determine that, how are you meant to actually put them into camps? And it becomes even more problematic. So now we've got the lovely children who are dressed up as tubs of lard. So, and I've called this like the influence of welfare policies in the camps. And there was one particular instance that I really want to talk about called Operation Carrot. So one of the major issues in the immediate post-war year was the issue of repatriation. So UNRWA was called the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, but it never actually defined what rehabilitation meant or what it was meant to mean. So the UNRWA workers themselves just started using their own interpretation of this. Some of them saw it as synonymous with repatriation, because that would mean the return to the status quo. Therefore, that's a form of rehabilitation. Others, especially if they were a bit more religious, saw it as rehabilitation of the soul. So in every displaced persons camp, depending on the people that you've got there, they're instituting policies that, because the policies from up above can't actually be implemented on the ground because they just don't match, they're implementing their own policies. And amongst all of this, you then get ridiculous programs like this. So I'm going to explain Operation Carrot, which has one of the most ridiculous names I've ever heard of. So UNRWA and the British tend to have this ability to come up with ridiculous names for operations, but this really is one of the best ones. So after repatriation was allowed to Poland from September 1945, the numbers didn't exactly go up very quickly because people were very apprehensive. They didn't want to return to Poland when they didn't know what the state of it was. Repatriation stopped over Christmas 1945 and winter because it was just too cold for the trains. But by spring 1946, they decided we need to do something to ensure that as many people as possible return. So Operation Carrot is offering any Polish person willing to voluntarily repatriate to Poland 60 days worth of food rations all at once. Literally a carrot. It's trying to lead them back to Poland with what one or, well, several dozen UNRWA workers called bait or a bribe. And Operation Carrots is going to become important to my work with the Pilecki-Institut as well, that I'm going to talk about in a bit. But it didn't actually have the desired effect. They also started putting newsreels on that were actually Soviet-commissioned newsreels called Return to Homeland, in case people were illiterate and they couldn't read the propaganda that was putting up around the camps. The numbers still didn't go up. So on the 1st of October 1946, they decided to ban any recreational, creative, or educational activities in displaced persons camps that held 100 or more Polish displaced persons. Only Poles. And it was entirely to make life as miserable as possible to ensure that you go back to Poland. And this was the brainchild of Fiorello LaGuardia, who used to be mayor of New York, but he became the head of UNRWA in 1946 for about a year. But this was also his big retirement party. He was trying to finish his career and just go and retire in upstate New York. He just had to close UNRWA down as quick as possible. And the only way to do that is to get rid of all the displaced persons. So it still didn't really work that well, but we do have quite a few writings from displaced persons who would try and set up theatre groups in camps, for instance. They'd get halfway through making the materials, collecting the people, making the costumes, and then they'd realize what they're doing and actually just disperse them to different camps, and just did that repeatedly. So you've got this bribe of Operation Carrot, then you've also got this enforced isolation and just boredom, really. So they're trying to disband the community to force you back to Poland, which is really problematic when the whole idea is nation building in Poland, right? So then we've got the fourth one. So what did the British actually do? You can see there's this lovely, quaint book that they had. So one of the reasons so many of them also refused repatriation is they really hoped that a resettlement opportunity would come up abroad. Most of the resettlement opportunities up until this point were for America, and they weren't readily available to people in the British zone. They often went to the Poles in the American zone, understandably. And Britain just wasn't opening any of its resettlements. So as you can see from this timeline, this is the timeline of British resettlement ideas and operations. So August 1945 is the first one that they implement, but that is almost entirely for Germans to join their distressed relatives in England. So you can imagine how that goes over in the displaced persons camps when the Poles are basically being told that they're being a troublesome nuisance. We then get the establishment of the Polish Resettlement Corps, so the almost full focus goes on members of the Polish army and their dependents. It's not, you can see at the very end, it's not until March 1947 that something called Operation Westward Ho, I did tell you they were stupid names, appear in displaced persons camps and start trying to recruit people. So if you look at October 1946, you can see Operation Bolt Signet, and a signet is a very odd word, but it means a young, beautiful swan. So what they were trying to recruit was any Baltic woman from the age of 18 to 40. And that was solely who they recruited. When they exhausted that pool in the British zone of occupation, they then decided to go ahead with Operation Westward Ho, which was meant to recruit 100,000 people. However, they only wanted Balts and Ukrainians. And the official line for this was because Balts and Ukrainian people had the ability to claim statelessness at this point because their countries had been subsumed into the USSR. Poland, however, still existed. Why didn't you just go back? And one of the major problems is, as I said, like before, when they're trying to group people into these displaced persons camps according to ethnicity, is a lot of the Ukrainians, to avoid being sent back as Soviet DPs, were claiming that they were Polish. And the UNRWA workers just can't tell the difference, and neither can the Quakers or the Red Cross. It was very difficult for them. And then all of a sudden these schemes come up, and the Ukrainian person, the Polish person becomes Ukrainian again. So we get this complete mess, as you can imagine, of people trying to claim one nationality over the other. And when they try and prove it, I mean, how many people are going to have documents with them at this point? How many are going to have documents that survived? So it was very difficult to try and work out what was happening. So they recruited only Ukrainians and Balts until they realized they could only get about 14,000 of them, and then eventually opened it up because they wanted 100,000 to everyone else, so Yugoslavs, Greeks, Poles, etc., etc. And still not that many actually ended up going to Britain on that scheme because there were very strict, what's the word, criteria for whether or not you could be accepted. So you weren't allowed to have any dependents. You weren't allowed to have been ill. Like if you'd had TB maybe 30 years previously, you still couldn't join because you've got spots on the lungs. So there was all these like ridiculous criteria for people who had been through war, were very hard to get past. So I've waffled on about my book quite a bit. Those are just some of the parts of the book. The end of the book actually talks about those who remain in Poland, no, not Poland, in occupied Germany as UNRWA and the International Refugee Organization comes to an end. And they become part of the Heimatlose Ausländergesetz, the homeless foreigners law, yeah, the homeless foreigners law. So they get officially classed as homeless foreigners because they didn't want to go back to Poland and they weren't eligible to resettle elsewhere. So this is, the majority of them are elderly, infirm, and pregnant most of the time. So this kind of like leads on to my work that I'm doing with the Pilecki-Institut. So my work up to this point has been concentrating on the ones who stayed in Germany. But the overwhelming majority did actually return to Poland, but it wasn't until about 1947. So I was trying to work out why that was. Again, that big official rhetoric is that there was just lack of opportunity, and therefore they decided to come back. But the majority of those left in the British zone by 1947 who weren't able-bodied men who were going to go on these resettlement schemes were the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and above all else, children. So there was a vast amount of children. Many of you may already be aware, I'm not entirely sure, but the Nazis ran a very big Germanization process where they basically stole children from across Europe and Germanized them. And then in the aftermath of war, when you're confronted with children who don't know their original names, original languages, or original families, it's hard to say whether or not that child was, for instance, actually Polish or was German. However, what I've actually, keep in mind my research is still ongoing, what I've actually found in the archives so far tells a really interesting story about how Britain was really involved with the new government that was based in Warsaw by 1947 in a very unofficial sort of capacity. So I'm just giving you some examples here of how the repatriation literature sort of evolved. So we've got a very early example of encouraging Poles to repatriate to Poland in June 1945. You know, democracy is going to win, everything's going to be wonderful, please come back. It didn't work, unsurprisingly. And then we move into 1946-47, when we get the creation of the Buy Zone, which was the British and the American zones fusing together on the 1st of January 1947. And they put these up all around the camps, and there was a whole lot of literature that went with it that's saying, do you want to rebuild Poland or Germany? So we're starting to move towards that nation-building sort of idea. And then the bit at the bottom, and it's accompanied by a lot more documents that I didn't feel like I should broadcast just yet. But basically, that Operation Carrot scheme where you have the 60 days worth of food rations should have ended, and it should have ended in mid-1947. What we actually find, or what I've found so far, in the literature within the archives, mostly at the Archive Mark Novick, is that, I don't know how to put this. So the military officials in the camps, who were not meant to be dictating who goes where and how and why, were basically talking with the officials in Warsaw to ensure that as many of the unaccompanied children as possible got repatriated to Poland to help Poland's nation-building exercise. And to help them repatriate, they were giving these 60 days worth of food rations to whoever would accept them into their homes. So this has really big ramifications, because some of these children are as young as 3 years old. They can't vote themselves into this ration scheme, and there aren't a lot of foster families available in Poland to actually take them on, so the majority of these rations are getting, and children are going to orphanages in Poland who have already previously said that they were full to capacity. But the military officials are basically, through the correspondence that I've read, talking to the, I think they're officially classed as Warsaw liaison officials, to try and make sure that as many children as possible get sent this way. So this is an operation that should have ended quite some time ago. It should not be applicable to children who can't even voice their own ideas, voice their own wishes. But what ends up happening, it seems, is that a lot of them end up in these foster homes, even when UNRWA's official mantra at this point is it needs to be in the best interests of the child. So alongside all of these documents, I've also found a lot of documents from UNRWA stating that they have, so it's naming an individual child, saying that someone wants to adopt them from the British zone of occupation. And UNRWA is saying we need to go through the paperwork, we need to find that out, and then the next thing they know, this child has then been taken to an orphanage in Katowice, for instance. So the best interests of the child kind of like fall to the wayside. And I've not really studied the history of displaced children that much, because it is an absolute minefield. If you do want to read something about it, there is a fantastic PhD thesis by someone called Catherine Rossi, who happens to be my co-editor for the UNRWA volume. But it is very in-depth, very interesting with the child search programs as well. So that is about where my research is up to. I hope that it's been somewhat illuminating, and I hope that we're going to have a nice conversation now. But thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Samantha, for this insightful talk. Markus, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Sam, Samantha, for this introduction into your book, but also like DP, Polish DP history in general in the British zone. So like what I'm trying to do is I prepared some three things, three questions I tried to answer, and then maybe some spontaneous reaction to what Samantha just said. So to put her book, or the book I read, into a broader context of not only Polish history, but also like post-war European history, DP history, what's going on in DP history in general, and why is her book important? Because I think it is. So why is this an important subject? Since you're here, you're probably assuming it is an important subject, but still, I guess, to be honest, it's important in at least two ways. The first one is it's important in terms of numbers. So the Germans were responsible for deporting hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens to German territory. So you didn't go into detail on this one, but it was forced laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and many, many other groups. So it's a high number of Polish citizens being in Germany, and especially under British rule, which is an ally of the Polish government in exile, that called for immediate action. Something had to be done because there are so many Poles in Germany. The Polish situation, or the situation of Polish DPs, is not unique in Germany, I would say. It resembles the situation of others from Eastern Europe, other DP groups from Eastern Europe, who also struggled with, should they return home to a changed home, to a new home under the Soviet influence or not? And that's, for example, the Czechoslovak DPs or the Hungarian populations, but and also, like, we can come back to this, of course, also the Jews, who also didn't answer the question of, just go home simply by saying yes. It was more complicated. And yet, the circumstances of the post-war political world turned the situation of Polish DPs in Germany into a highly controversial subject. And I think that's why it is important. It's a very controversial subject. And one could even argue that the struggle over repatriation versus staying put, staying in exile, was one of the first conflicts in the emerging Cold War. So a truly fundamental fight between independence and foreign rule, democracy versus Soviet communism. And I'm sure Samantha could talk about more of this, because that's really the language of the documents in many ways. So it's one of the first conflicts in the Cold War. So in short, the subject deserves way more attention, and I think Samantha's book covers this complex field in a great way. That brings me to the second point. So what is Samantha's addition to the field, at least from my perspective? One thing that's very obvious, but that's really important, I think, if you're working on Polish history, is that it's a book in English, because there has been some research on Polish history that Samantha could build upon. And that's, for example, Jan Rydel or Katarzyna Persson or Andreas Lembeck, for example, who have all published books either in Polish or in German or both, but not in English. So Samantha's book, Samantha belongs to as far as I can tell, a group of British historians working on post-war history with special regard to the Polish DPs, together with, for example, Katarzyna Nowak, who is also publishing a very not very similar, but a similar book on Polish DPs. It's not a similar book. She also published the book on Polish DPs in Germany.
She's a very close friend, don't worry.
and yeah, she's a close friend of yours. I was assuming that. But it's obviously not just the language, and by using or by writing Polish history in English, there's obviously like a transfer of knowledge also from what is going on in Polish and German historiography into English historiography, which is, I guess, really important here. But it's an obvious thing, rather. But the more important thing, I guess, is that historians of post-war European history, and that's the broader context, I guess, have only recently understood the displaced persons case in terms of humanitarianism. So while the UNRWA, the IRO, the Joint, like the biggest Jewish organization, relief organizations, and many, many other relief organizations have always been there. Like, every book on DP history has always included those names. Many historians have rather focused on the displaced persons themselves, the Allied armies, or the Germans. The Germans who were living around the displaced persons camps. But less on those individuals, as you call it, in the middle, right? Like the people who were in charge, the people who were actually there taking care of the DPs in what way in one way or another. I would say that this lack of interest is no coincidence, because even today we can see the same. If we look at how research on the current emigration from Ukraine to the West, looks like it's also that this research puts the refugees in the center, which is obvious. You know, it's a good thing to do, obviously, and it's very important. But again, once again, few scholars are interested in studying those people who are responsible for the refugees. You know, if you're in Berlin or in Warsaw, you know that there's people at the train stations and in many, many other places who are, doing great work, voluntary work, very, challenging work. But I guess I would assume that very few people will interview them, right? So that's basically what happened 70 years ago, and I think it's important that you do it. And this is why it's innovative, I guess. And the third question, what can we learn from her book about the post-war period and DP history in general, and what could be next steps, except for, the project you already mentioned. So I guess what's fair to say, and that's also why thank you, Mateusz, for mentioning the DP book. If you're working on DP history, you can build upon many, many works now, which is great. It's not a new thing. You don't have to explain to other historians, to other, at least, or also people, just basically interested in post-war history, what DPs were. That's fairly established. But a number of recent publications have shown not only the history of various individual DP groups, such as Jewish DPs, Polish DPs, Ukrainians, and others, but also how international governments and relief organizations dealt with the DPs. And that's, I guess, important here as future immigrants, like, people coming from Europe to their countries, or from the perspective of citizens' rights, former citizens, future citizens, whatever, or stateless people. That's what Samantha mentioned with the German government taking over the hardcore cases, as they were called, all those people who have remained in Germany, and just, calling them people with no home. That's basically the German translation, right? So that's what's going on, or what has been going on, I guess, in DP history. And why I guess this is an important contribution to the field is also that the British zone of occupation in Germany has still, at least from my perspective, been relatively under-researched in comparison to the US zone in Germany. And the same is true for non-Jewish DP research in English. That has highlighted the situations of, that is true for non-Jewish DPs as well. So non-Jewish DPs in the British zone. That's what we still need to find out more. What has been done fairly, or what has been done, let's say, to a higher degree, was a research on the situation of Jews, and especially Polish Jews as DP, but there is very little comparative research on Polish Jews and non-Jewish DPs in Germany. And Austria, I guess, should also be mentioned. And just to give you one very obvious example, why this could be interesting. So for roughly 1 year after the liberation from Nazism, there was a Polish and Jewish DP camp in the proximity of the former concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen, which from a British perspective, I guess, is something at least as important as Auschwitz, right? Like that's, the British army liberated this camp. And in the proximity of Bergen-Belsen was the DP camp Belsen, the largest Jewish DP camp, or to be largest Jewish DP camp in the British zone. But for 1 year, it was a Polish, non-Jewish, and Jewish DP camp at the same time. So like they had a shared committee, a camp committee. They had to communicate. They had to debate certain issues, and it was Poles and Jews together. But that I would say that's not an exception. Those contacts between, if we want to call it, those two different groups, Polish Jews and non-Jewish Poles. Those contacts were rather frequent. They were talking about each other. They were well aware of each other. They were, reading about each other. So, like, there's much to do about it. Also, because the matter of anti-Semitism, the matter of how Jews were treated during the war in Poland, how Jews are being treated in Germany by other Poles or something is such it's a very emotional, very controversial topic, but it just shows very well, I guess, that there has been some interaction, and this interaction, I guess, needs to be studied more in more depth, I guess. Okay, that brings me to another field of research. In the existing historiography, DPs are very often studied separately. So according to their nationality, that's Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Czechoslovaks, Yugoslav, and so on. But the Polish case, I guess, and that's also what Samantha does in her book, offers new perspectives, but I guess it could be done maybe in the future, even with the Repatriation project, a little more. And that's, Samantha knows this, everyone probably in this room knows this, but the Second Polish Republic was a multinational state, right? With large ethnic minorities, Jews, Ukrainians, and Belarusians being the largest ones, with pre-1939 Polish citizenship. They found themselves on German territories, on German soil too. You mentioned it briefly with those Poles, Ukrainians, and vice versa. But how do we include them into a broader understanding of Polishness in the early post-war period? I guess that's still something that could be thought about a little more. And obviously from a German perspective, you mention it in the book, but I guess it could be interesting also for those who are rather working on German documents, on German post-war history. And that is what happened to those Polish DPs who were rather who remained in Germany after the DP era ended. And how did the wartime and post-war experience shape their lives in Germany? I guess that's even more interesting since Germany has a long history of Polish immigration, right? Poles have been living in Germany for centuries. There was a tradition of self-organization, of organizing Polish life, Polish religious life, cultural life in Germany. And those Polish DPs entered this tradition, whether they wanted it or not. So how did the Polish DPs morph into the Polish immigrant society in post-war Germany, and how did they understand their role in the Cold War as political exiles? Some of those questions have been answered, I guess, on a more basic way, but I guess there's much more to be done, and that's basically what I'm trying to say. Is not Samantha should do all of this, but that your book is actually a great starting point for future historians to go down this path, and will hopefully inspire future historians of Polish history. So thank you.
Many thanks. Samantha, could you respond to these remarks?
Thank you. There's a lot of remarks. I'm just trying to remember. So the one that you just said there as well, I have actually just published a chapter on the relationship between post-war Polish DPs and Ruhr-Poland. So Poles from like maybe second, third generation in the Ruhr area of Germany. And how they just did not integrate with one another because it's that whole highlighting of otherness. So this, community in the Ruhr area of Germany that's been there since the end of the 19th century had managed to blend in, but it gets even more complicated than that because they were also on the Volksliste as being German enough. They were the top two categories. But when the Polish displaced persons then start, because the British zone is the Ruhr, essentially, they start filtering out of the camps when the camps start getting shut down. I mean, a lot of the camps existed till, not a lot, but a few of the camps existed till 1956. So they didn't go away quickly. When they tried to form ties and relationships with these more established Polish groups, it didn't go very well. Because it was kind of like, no, you're a different type of Pole. Because they'd been long established, already got their organizations, and then this is a very new type of Pole. One of the things that I should have mentioned in my talk as well is that the majority of the Polish displaced persons in the camps, which I think you mentioned briefly, they weren't the elite, they weren't multilingual, they didn't, a lot of them weren't army members because they separated out ex-army members and displaced persons. So these displaced persons were almost solely forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners. And the majority of them are what got classified as the Lud, so just the people. I think there was about a 35% illiteracy rate, and also many of them did not speak the Polish that I've learned in classes, for instance. It was, so even if an UNRWA worker did know Polish, they would be stumped quite a lot of the time when they're trying to speak to people. Yeah, there are definitely people working on a variety of things. He mentioned Katarzyna Nowak, and I just want to say that you should definitely read her book as well when it comes out. It's called Kingdom of Barracks, and she looks at she looks at everything from a very cultural perspective and couches it in the terms of like this whole idea that it's a new great exile. So taking that sort of 19th century romantic tradition and kind of putting it in place in the immediate post-war years. But her topic also covers the entirety of Austria as well, so it's Austria and Germany. And it's, I edited part of the work, so it's it's a beautiful piece of work I very highly recommend. There are really interesting avenues opening up, and pretty much every time I open a file at the Act Novik, which just seems to be full of these absolute gems at the minute, I'm coming across things that could easily turn into full research projects. The one I did at the minute, so I mentioned Operation Carrot, and I know I might have skipped over a few details, but keep in mind this is the stuff that I talk about day in and day out, so if I'm missing anything, please let me know. But UNRWA apparently decided that Operation Carrot wasn't enough and put on an even bigger operation called Spring Homecoming, where instead of using the food rations as a sort of bait, they just bombarded displaced persons with different types of propaganda. And when I say different types, I mean everything from posters to musical troupes to poetry readings and just, you know, informational plaques of people declaring that they'd been home to Poland, it was wonderful. These are the, you know, you can open up an opticians in Warsaw now, everything's great, life is back to normal and you should go. And that's one of the things that kind of helped drive adult numbers up, but obviously I've started looking at the children case because I mentioned Katowice as well, because that's where they actually found a whole bunch of, don't know how to describe them. So they're cards with the pictures of children on that have their original Polish names and their new German names and their new German addresses. So literally detailing the Germanization process. So I'm going to follow them and see where they go as well, because if anything, the Nazis were well prepared with documents, weren't they? So that helped. But yeah, there are quite a few lines of inquiry that I would like to focus on. Thank you very much for your very nice comments about my book. Hopefully it was enlightening in some way. But one of the things that I speak a lot with people at the Pilecki-Institut about as well is, and I talked about this a bit at the very beginning of my talk, is people just don't know Polish history. And I don't want to just stand in the middle of a room and be like, yeah, you should know about Poland. But there are multiple reasons why the British in general need to interact more with Polish history. One of the first things I normally ask my students is like, do you know anyone who's Polish? And every single person in the class puts their hand up because they all know someone who's Polish. And I'm just like, what do you know about Poland? And it's just silence. I'm like, but you know a lot about Germany and Russia? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, what's in the middle? And they're like, Poland. But they don't understand how Poland plays into British history, and it really is quite a strong component, especially in the 20th century. But it's not really talked about in classrooms or even in seminars to some extent. So like Katarzyna Nowak, we work on very similar topics, for instance. And the reason we became so close is because we couldn't find anyone else as well. There's just not people working on Polish displaced persons, even though they're so numerous. Jan Rydal's work I use quite a lot, as well as Czesław Łuczak and Anders Lembeck, for instance. But you're right, like having that in English, I'm hoping makes people realize how interconnected these histories really are. Because a lot of people just go from the American especially, but also the British and the German, and then that's kind of it, really. The other thing that I want to comment on that I did mention a little bit, at least in my head, I'm not sure if I mentioned it out loud, but a lot of the research on displaced persons camps has been on the American zone. And the reason that that's happened is because The OMGUS records, so the American Army records, were made available very quickly after the end of the Second World War. So people kind of flocked to them and then decided that whatever happened in the American zone must have also happened in the British and the French zones at the same time. Which, I don't know if you know Laura Humbert at Manchester University, but she's just written a book on French aid and UNRWA in the French zone as well. So there are people talking about these things, but it's very slow in upcoming. But thank you very much.
I would like to encourage all of you to ask the questions and comments. Maybe some of you want already to ask such a question. Please.
I was wondering if many of the displaced persons were women, because I guess many, or maybe the majority of slave workers were women, and then there were also prisoners of war who were also slave workers, but the prisoners of war, were they treated as army members or differently?
Yeah, so there was, the majority were women, about 60, 70%. It wasn't a huge majority, it wasn't like there was just a small amount of men. So it might have come across a little bit, but UNRWA was really quite disorganized by the time it set up the displaced persons camps and had to rely on the military more than they wanted. So prisoners of war, ex-prisoners of war, should have been separated from displaced persons, but there was a lot of mixing anyway, because they weren't sure who belonged to where. There was a lot of women who were former members of, for instance, the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, but weren't officially members of the Polish armed forces that fought alongside the British. So what category they got put in was anyone's guess. Again, it was up to those individuals who were basically recording their existence. But there was, the majority in the displaced persons camps, especially in the British zone, I can't speak for the American zone, were women, maybe about 70%.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. My first question is about relation of DPs and society outside this camp, so German society basically. Were there any interferences? There must have been some, but how far you find it in the sources, in the files, maybe in oral history interviews? And the second question is more general, and in both direction, German reactions and maybe also newcomers, those from the East Germans, yes, who came. If there were any, so putting it differently, how much isolated they were as a special group in this, maybe more than during, I don't know, forced labor camps. So how far they were in touch with German society and with what forms. And another question is more, let's say, methodological or theoretical. Do you frame the whole research you do, because the story you presented is a kind of the topic in itself, like a separated important topic for research, a kind of case for also other DPs and so on. But my question would be, do you see it more as a story of consequences of the war and how to cope with people reshufflement, so to say, caused by war and war consequences, or do you frame it more as a post-war history of how building new states in new political, political, geographical, geopolitical setting by international organization in this case, or maybe you frame it in more abstract historiographical terms like modernity, management of people in modern times or post-war modern times in this particular, of course, place and context, but with some more general, categories, theoretical frames, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll answer the second one first. So I very much frame it as it's primarily a post-war story, I guess. But because UNRWA was actually created during wartime for peacetime purposes, it really traces that shifting, like the shifting geopolitical situation in general. So like, because I'm looking at it from a British point of view, like Britain as a superpower is really crumbling at this point, and it's clutching at straws a lot of the time. So it's interesting to see the different interactions there. So for instance, one of the main themes of the book, the breakdown of the Anglo-Polish relationship, is a consequence of of Britain needing to placate Stalin in every way possible to try and retain some sort of chair amongst America and the Soviet Union, for instance. So it's very much framed within these relationships, and these dynamics are very much shifting, and when international humanitarianism is thrown in there, Britain sees that as the opportunity to be like, we can still be big players. Because UNRWA is made up of 44 nations, and each nation donated 1% of its national income, which meant that America actually funded 72% of the whole thing, and Britain funded 13%. Right? So you've got to imagine how small the other percentages are. And there was quite a few of the organization's planners. One of they basically said, you know, America and Britain are UNRWA's real parents. So this is meant to be a state-driven international organization, but it's still Anglo-American in pretty much every sense of the word. Like even just ideas about welfare, they're very American. They're very, you know, bringing in new concepts like PTSD, for instance. A lot of the UNRWA welfare workers who weren't British or American were like, what on earth is that? Like, why why do we have to care for these people's mental state? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Or shell shock, as it was known after the First World War. So it's really tracing that and how that bleeds into the post-war story. And as Markus said, it's kind of an early indication of the Cold War. Because the Poles who were resettling in America, they very much frame their resettlement as a fight and crusade against communism, because that's what America wants to hear. And the way that America pitches it to ordinary American citizens, because they have to sign affidavits and say, yes, I'll be responsible for them financially, basically because they don't want to be a welfare state, is they have to say, well, you know, they resisted them throughout the war. You don't get anyone that's more anti-communist than a Pole. And that's how they managed to get such a large number. But because Britain was sitting somewhere in the middle, it's much harder to navigate that. The first question about how much there was interaction, in the first instance, there was none because of that non-fraternization order in place. So that really skewed how many Germans could come in and out of the camp complexes because they weren't allowed to interact with the British Army. But UNRWA could interact with them. It very quickly broke down because it was just not practical whatsoever. And then I should also mention that UNRWA had different classifications of workers. So when they realized that they didn't have enough people that were class 1, they started hiring class 2, which was the displaced persons themselves, and also Germans. So you had, like, in offices working away, doing administrative work about transport, you would have local German girls and displaced persons who maybe had just come out of a forced labor camp. So it was a very interesting interaction. I've only, there's quite a few people who have written memoirs and stories about it, but a lot of them are written 20, 30 years after the fact. So we really need to take a very critical eye as to how they're trying to frame themselves within the story, but they're still telling nonetheless. There's also some wonderful fictionalized accounts of displaced persons camps. So there's one called The Camp of All Saints by someone called Tadeusz Nowakovski, and he was actually at Maczków, which was the biggest displaced persons camp in the British zone, that Jan Riedel has written thoroughly on. And he was there as a teacher, but he creates a fictionalized account of that camp and calls it Papenburg instead. And there's a very Romeo and Juliet sort of trope to it. So there's a Polish displaced person in love with a German girl, and how their societies pull them apart. And that in itself, just the way that he wrote that, because it was published, I think, in 1949, it's quite telling of the ongoing Cold War, like, heating up. But yeah, so there was a lot of young German girls in particular working within the camps in administration. But as army members started getting demobbed, as 1946, 47 came around and people were still in the camps, they started hiring more Germans from the surrounding area. And in the British zone, which was quite heavily devastated, there wasn't that many jobs elsewhere. So it ended up being quite a high rate of German workers in the camps. And it was an interesting mix.
I think basing on remarks by Markus and Piotr, I think it could be interesting to formulate such a conclusion that or remark that that this field of DPs, of displaced persons, is just after the Second World War is quite a good place or can be used as a different kind of case study. I mean, the case study of the beginning of the Cold War. So the case study of yes, so in a way, so Orientalism. I mean, this perception of Easterners by Westerners. The case study of, or other possible case study, I would say, could be. So you mentioned this contribution to the European history. I mean, that in particular moment of migration of the not only migration, but I would say that it was the birth of the new order and such also the state, such as Hobbesian state. I mean, that on one hand there was the strong military structures. But on the other hand, there was the void of lack of any rules and also uncertainty of this old people. I think also that this case is also could be the case study of the particular sort of competition about this people. I mean that on one hand we have the new regime in Poland, observing these people and looking for them. So then we have government in exile. Then we have the authorities of occupational authorities of Great Britain, and also this local environment, German environment. I would say that it's very flexible piece of empirical evidence, and yes, and I'm very curious, looking forward to reading the whole book, because this is probably, I would repeat this question. And so what kind of case study is for you the most important, or what did you choose?
I don't know. For me, like whenever I try to explain it to someone, it very much changes depending on what I know their interests are. Like I might emphasize one aspect over the other. But for me, it's the beginning of that international humanitarianism that's state-driven, that's meant to cover the entire world, but in reality, it's actually largely based on the Atlantic Charter that the British and Americans kind of held up to the world and then burned in front of our faces at the same time, because they didn't really adhere to any of it. So it's based on a very loose conception of what should have happened, and then it's actually morphed into what we know today, because UNRWA becomes UNICEF, it becomes UNESCO, it becomes WHO, it becomes pretty much everything that we already know. So like tracing the roots of UNRWA, because there's definitely something before UNRWA as well, it's just not as clearly connected, is really interesting to me, because then all of the other histories feed into that and are tangled up within it at the same time.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting last comment referring to the beginning of your speech and this frame of humanitarian law and humanitarian help as international issue. The picture you showed us seemed to be far away or not from these values or our understanding of humanitarian aid or these principles. So I think very great potential of critical study of these roots of this movement. I wanted to ask you about the sources you're using and this micro perspective, individual perspective. There are lacking individual testimonies, as I understand, books or memoirs that have been published. But what are possible other sources to reach or look for? Press articles, maybe. Have you tried to reconstruct this history by studying Polish or German press? Maybe there are also some. That would be a good question. Maybe Markus knows whether there are memoirs, some kind of testimonies or records of persons in German persons involved in the structure as staff of the DPs camps. So, what is the possible area for this microhistory research concerning DP camps, not only in British zone but in general? And my second question would be to both of you about the differentiations between groups of DP camps, not prisoners, but DPs in different occupation zones, but also in Austria. How did these groups interacted? How were they perceived by the German or Austrian society? Whether there were differentiations within and in the interaction with the outside world. Thank you.
Okay, so there are private papers that I've been looking at from former UNRWA workers. Someone very lovely in the 1980s decided to record the private histories of some UNRWA workers and then deposited them in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which was very nice of them. It's not complete. There is also some oral histories at the Imperial War Museum. So the Imperial War Museum a few years ago went and tried to gather as many ordinary people's wartime experiences and soon realized that a lot of people had worked for UNRWA and they created this whole folder. There are published memoirs, there are unpublished memoirs, there are, as I said, the fictionalized accounts. A lot of them, when you read the fictionalized accounts, they're barely fictionalized. You can tell that they might have altered a name here and there, but the majority of the things, they seem like they definitely would have happened because it's come across in real memoirs before, like the same sort of things. I've read some German memoirs, so there's a German girl called Lieselette Becker who works as a assistant in Wentorf, displaced persons camp in the British zone, and she works for R.S. Lawson, I think his name was. So that was her boss. He was a British military guy, and Lieselette Becker was, I think she was like a 17 or 18-year-old girl at the time, but she kept a diary, which was helpful. So I've read hers as well. The only thing that I haven't really come across is Polish memoirs, specifically of that time. And because Katarzyna Nowak works a lot with cultural material, as I said, so pretty much all of her work ignores that superstructure sort of stuff, and it focuses entirely on the people themselves. And she's struggled as well to find memoirs. The thing that we do have reams of is petitions for resettlement. So people writing from their own personal experience to try and resettle in the United States, for instance. But in a very blunt way, the majority of those archives, they're very telling for a lot of reasons, but they're not very helpful for the way I did my research, because they're essentially, more often than not, about 80% of these letters are just lying because they know what the Americans want to hear to be accepted. They have to lie about pre-war experiences, wartime experiences, because they want the best, the brightest, but also the cleanest records for people who have been through war, which is ridiculous. But they're playing the game, essentially, and that's very interesting within itself. But yeah, there are a lot. I've been to archives in Germany, in France, in Poland, in England to try and gather as many as possible. I have my favorites, mainly because of how they write. So Rhoda Dawson is very sassy. She's very quick-witted and very sarcastic, and she brings like a real... She's not very favorable towards herself a lot of the time, so you get the sense, because she's not the nicest of people, but you get the sense that you're getting a legitimate, or as close to a legitimate viewpoint from her as possible. So I use her quite a lot throughout the book, I think. And then in terms of groups and how they interact, there are some works that do comparisons. I'm struggling to think of any off the top of my head, though. Most people tend to stick with individual displaced persons groups because the authorities went to such... Anatolian, yeah. So there's a book called Between National Socialism and Soviet Communism by Anatolian, and she looks at Poles, Russians...
I think Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, I guess.
There's also a Soviet element in there as well.
Maybe that's the Soviet Ukrainians.
Okay, maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a great book.
It is. It is. It's a very good book. But yeah, it would be interesting to do one as Markus suggested as well, especially with the very large Polish Jewish contingent and then also the Jewish contingent. The only files that I found very early on are ones where they're documenting fighting between the groups because they didn't separate them initially. And again, UNRWA and the Allies pretty clueless at this point. They don't understand why all these Baltic peoples are fighting. Like if you put all the Balts in one space, what's the problem with that? And it's very much the same for Poles and Ukrainians. So one of the documents that I didn't put up because I only found it last week is there's a whole order that goes around in March 1945 that says not to recognize Ukrainians as Ukrainian because it doesn't exist. And that they have to either be, I think it says Soviet, Polish, Ruthenian, Romanian, maybe Lithuanian. And then it gives reasons as to why Ukrainians shouldn't exist. But at some point there is obviously a different document that comes around because we do have Ukrainian displaced persons camps. But yeah, I mean, comparing them would be, how do you compare as well? Like, are you comparing experience or, yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah. I really like your question, and I've been asking it also like with other people because I'm part of a displaced persons network that in Germany that is trying to gather as many people as possible working on DP history. That's our basic common fact, right? We all are interested in DP history, and the idea was, and we also meet every 2 years or something, and the idea is to not everyone should write about Polish DP history separately as isolate as if it was some kind of island. Because that's not just what people at the time also understood. That's not the way they understood their world. They did not understand themselves as being totally separated from every other DP or refugee community. As I said, those people were reading the newspapers. They were well aware of how the Allied treated the Baltic DPs, mistreated the Polish ones or the Jewish ones, how the Yugoslav DPs were treated. All those things people were very aware of, and I think it's there are many things to compare, but one of the things I find almost impossible, I have no idea how to solve that actually, is you should be capable of reading sources in many foreign languages, right? I mean, maybe let's say even if we at least know at least 2, 3, or 4 foreign languages, and that's already that's good already. That's a start. But for doing DP history, you should know at least 5 or 6 or 7 to adequately do, for example, like some sociological research or anthropology, stuff like that, where you're saying, okay, like I know it was not an island, and that's also the way I want to treat it in terms of methodology, but I don't really know how to do it because I only know the sources in Polish, whatever, Yiddish, Hebrew, whatever sources you know. And that's actually one of the most as I said, I don't really know how to cope with it. That's why we have so many. That's at least what I think. That's why we have so many studies on individual DP groups, because people knowing Polish history work on Polish DP history. That's what they do, right? And the same with Czechoslovak and Jewish DPs. People were using, if you want to work on Jewish DPs, like you have to know Yiddish at least, because that's the lingua franca they used.
Maybe this is exactly the point for, or case for
Yeah, sure. I'm absolutely for that. But to start with, I guess we need those individual studies, it is great, and it's still, I think it will continue to be like that for some time. But maybe at some point, also using maybe digital humanities, it will be possible to compare sources and somehow to overcome the language barrier in some way. Maybe like I'm guessing you want to say something, but let me answer the question about the German sources. The book about Matschkuf, like this very small, or not small, I mean, it used to be a German. A German town. That's what I wanted to say. A German town, and it was more or less the German population was basically thrown out, and the Polish DPs moved into these places, and it was renamed Matschkuf, right, after one of the military people around. And if you want to know about the German perspective, you can study the administration files from the period, from the towns and cities around Matschkuf, who are well aware of what is happening there, and who are documenting it, who are writing about their debates. They're basically complaining all the time, obviously, because they are the poor Germans, and all those Polish DPs get all the food and medicine and stuff like that. And now they get our apartments, and it's a very typical case of how the German post-war population reacted to the DP issue, complaining and somehow putting themselves into competition with the DPs. But I think there is way more to be done how the Germans perceived the DPs. And also that's maybe easier with languages. If you know German, then you can see how how the Germans wrote about the Jewish, the Polish, and Ukrainian, and whatever DP groups. But it's just one direction, obviously.
I was just going to say very quickly on that, I'm about to start another project with a guy called Rhoda Ritter, who's at Technische-Universität Chemnitz, who's working on Harren, and who wants to create it. Yeah. So Harren became Matschkuf. Matschkuf is Harren. You're right, the British and Canadian Army, this was going to be part of the presentation. I was like, no one needs anything about Matschkuf. So the British and Canadian Army overnight threw out the entire population of Harren and turned it into Matschkuf. It was within like 16 hours. They evacuated the entire town and told them to go wherever the hell they want, just not there. And almost everyone who was in Matschkuf were members of I've forgotten, there were members of particular units in the Polish army and their dependents. So it was named after General Maciek, so in his honor. And then in 1948, the whole thing reversed. The Poles left. It was an entirely Polish town. They had Polish mayor, Polish bakers, Polish orphanages, printing press, everything. Yeah, it was the full enclave. That's one of the two case studies in my chapter about when I was talking about Polishness. The other one is Wentorf, where Lizalette Becker worked. And in 1948, because most of them are army members, they end up in Britain under the Polish Resettlement Act. So because they're filtering out and they've got somewhere to go, all the members who were from Harren just start trickling back in from the surrounding cities like Leer and Papenburg and things like that. So, yeah. But me and I'm the outside expert, apparently. I'm not sure why he hasn't contacted Jan Rodel, but let's not question it. And we're going to create a very small exhibition on double forced migration, essentially. So forced migration in and out in the same year. It was meant to happen pre-COVID, or just as COVID was about to start. So it's very slow in getting up and running again. It's also worth mentioning as well that when we do look at things like Polish displaced persons camp, not everyone in there is Polish, right? The Allies tried their best to make sure that everything was segregated, but funnily enough, some Poles were married to Ukrainians and some Latvians were married to Poles. So you end up with you always get these descriptions of Polish displaced persons camp with a smattering of Latvians or something like that. It'll always have with extras, because there are always others. So I've always wanted to try and find out how those relationships played out, because they set up camp committees that are normally very very nationalistic in their viewpoints. So if they do have other minorities within the camps, then it becomes quite contentious as well. But yes, it would be very interesting to do a really big one.
Is there anybody who wants to ask? Okay, so maybe Patrick.
So first of all, Dr. Knapton, thanks a lot for this talk, which was as illuminating as it was lucid. And if it indeed constituted quote-unquote waffling, then we need to redefine this term. Just a quick question, because some of the documents that you've presented here, they revealed a special sort of cold-hearted rationality, indifference, and lack of perspective within the decision makers of the middle sphere. And I just have a very speculative idea, and I wonder if you if you happen to stumble across any traces of that. Like, as we know, the picture that the British press created about Poland, especially before '39, was far from rosy and favorable. And I wonder whether you found any traces of preconceptions or stereotypes dating back to that era. Thank you.
Yes. So kind of on Dominica's question as well, a little bit, I do use the press quite a lot. I did comparisons of how Poles were talked about in the German press, for instance, after the Homeless Foreigners Law, and it was almost exclusively in negative terminology. And then in the British press, in particular, there's a massive switch between UNRWA and the IRO. So UNRWA is meant to focus on repatriation, and the IRO is meant to focus on resettlement. And you see this complete change in the way that they start talking about different displaced persons groups. So under UNRWA, it's kind of like, we've done our utmost for Poland. They need, like, these extra displaced persons just need to go home. And that's kind of where they leave it. And then when the IRO takes over, they very much talk about how Poles are very hardworking souls. Wouldn't it be nice if they were our neighbours? Maybe they should come to Britain. And in the British press in particular, I did an analysis of 1945 to 1951, and overwhelmingly Latvians and Ukrainians who appeared in newspapers always appeared as piano players, as very highly cultured. The kids get along great. School is such a fun time. And when Poles ever appeared, it was, again, criminality, which is why I then did a comparison with Germany as well. But then after 1947 in the British papers, that drops. So it's quite interesting because they're obviously trying to change how they're seen. But I don't know if you know, but when a lot of Poles get to Britain, they end up in something called Nissan Huts, which are these tiny makeshift tin accommodations that are meant to be temporary, but because there was a housing shortage in Britain, they weren't very temporary. And a lot of Poles were very reluctant to move out of them in the end as well because they'd created communities. And there's still some Nissan Huts that I think you can see, but they're just like these round tin sort of structures. But yes, I hope that sort of answers your question. Yes.
Thank you, Mateusz. Okay, is this working? Working. I wonder because you were talking about the dynamics between generally speaking about dynamics between UNRWA and British government, and I wonder if there are any traces about the involvement of the government of Poland at that time, and to enlarge these dynamics into the triangle between Polish government, UNRWA, and British government, because. For example, when we look at the policy of the communist government after the war toward Polish immigration, they were trying, even in a very secret way, using secret service to pursue people who were abroad, to Poles who were abroad, and to get them back to the country. And I wonder if they were trying any of that kind of policy toward the British and UNRWA, because I think it would be also very interesting in this frame of the Cold War. Maybe it was this very unique sphere, especially at the beginning of the Cold War and after the Second World War, when those interests of Britain and United Nations at that time and communist government in Poland, they were mutual. They were the same, and maybe that would be, one of the unique cases of collaboration at the time.
Yeah, no, there are some traces of that. So one of the things that each country that belonged to UNRWA was meant to do was send liaison officers into the displaced persons camps so they could give them a realistic idea as to what to expect when they repatriated. The problem with Polish liaison officers is the majority of them were hired when the London government in exile was still in power. So then the Warsaw government takes over and they're wondering why people aren't repatriating, but the liaison officers are normally ex-army members who are working on behalf of the London government in exile. So more than anything, they're going around the camps being like, don't go back, don't do it, everything's a lie, that sort of thing. And UNRWA tries to step in at some point to be like, oh, this is the problem. So they start hiring Warsaw repatriation officers, but the ratio is just too low. They just can't get enough. I think by 1947, it's something like 10% are Warsaw loyal repatriation officers and the other 90% are not. So then, but UNRWA, like, I love UNRWA. It is, I really love it as a research topic, but it was an utter mess. And they just can't keep track of the fact that these things aren't working because of very particular reasons. And even when the Polish problem became a big enough problem for them to actually pay attention, like Operation Carrot, that was what they wanted to do. They wanted a quick fix. They didn't try to think, well, what else is actually preventing these people from going back? I've written an article, actually, on repatriation attempts and what the extra problems were within the British zone. And one of them was that they stopped all displaced person newspapers from being circulated that weren't backed by the Warsaw government. And the other one was the British didn't realize at first that they weren't allowed to re-accept displaced persons. So ones who had already been repatriated hated the conditions and walked back to Germany, or traveled back to Germany, and then just let them into the camps. And obviously that was not a good sign for those who were thinking about repatriation. But after that really big repatriation drive, the one that I kind of mentioned at the very end, Spring Homecoming, one of the policies was as soon as someone indicated that they were interested in repatriation, they had to be removed from that displaced persons camp and put in a special camp so no one could alter their decisions. And it was those sorts of steps that started really engaging. But I've found quite a few documents of the British government basically complaining about Archishevsky quite a bit. They liked Mikolajczyk, and then he ran off. So they couldn't really deal with him anymore. But they found that Archishevsky was, I think the exact terminology was too vocal. And they just started ignoring the majority of his pleas, essentially, and just said it's up to UNRWA. And then divorce themselves from UNRWA.
Many thanks. So maybe I would have the last question. So I think so. There's such an argument of and book by Teda Scottspole about how institutionalization of support for war veterans contributed to institutionalization of welfare state. And my question is, do you think that this broad organizational aspect of DPs and several contributions by these humanitarian actions, so it's UNRWA and other organizations, in one way or another way contributed to something? So the concept of humanitarian aid, or maybe the post-war welfare system, the notion of welfare. So how the peace, so to say, contributed, and the whole environment, institutional environment of the peace contributed to our thinking about this welfare and what people need and so on, and how states, for example, these new states, or after the Second World War, should contribute to the needs of these people.
Yes, that's a very big question. I think that it did contribute quite a bit. There's a lot of American welfare ideas that come in very early on, but they're also fused with, so it's about looking after the not just physically looking after the person, but also making sure that they are mentally well as well. This idea that, I mean, nowadays we say mental health, but that definitely was not the terminology then. They would often talk about broken psyches and then try and understand that. I think there was massive steps made in psychological welfare, in terms of state psychological welfare, that came out of UNRWA. I know that there's a contributor to one of the contributors to your book on displaced persons talked about the reports that UNRWA actually worked from, and on Stella Fry, worked on talking about how UNRWA created this framework for how psychologists need to deal with people who have been through multiple traumas at the same time, and not just giving them a blanket and some soup is going to fix that. But as I said as well, like, because UNRWA never defined rehabilitation, people just kind of did what they wanted a lot of the time. So if you had a displaced persons camp that was largely not run by UNRWA staff, there was like maybe 6 UNRWA staff and 20 Quakers who were working on behalf of the Friends Ambulance Service, it would be a very religiously driven type of rehabilitation. So reconnecting with your God would be the thing that they would want to do, essentially.
The last one.
Hi. Can you see some similarities in between the policy of the carrot operation, or creating very, very unbearable conditions in the camps there, and, for example, Greek islands right now?
Yes. The simple answer would be yes. So I like looking at UNRWA because I like looking at it, but it's also quite sad because the UNRWA planners knew what needed to happen and it didn't really fully happen, and that story hasn't changed all that much. We still know that a person needs multiple aspects in their life in order to feel safe and stable, but most welfare organizations rely on either being state funded or charity funded, and there's just not the resources there. Yes, I still think some mistakes, there's progress, definitely, but there's also a way to go, I would say.
Yeah, I was thinking especially about the situation when there were like modular homes waiting, and the agencies didn't allow them to be used there because that would create too comfy situation, and they really wanted these people to write home, don't come.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So one of the problems in Britain as well is that they were really worried about there was going to be a Polish ghetto in London because of the amount of the people who came over because of the Polish resettlement course. So then if they also had the displaced persons and they were all living in these barrack type installations, they're never going to integrate. So they wanted them to integrate rather than make them as uncomfortable as possible, which is what happened in the camps, I guess. At least when they came to Britain, they were trying to disband the communities so that they would form into the bigger community rather than keep them separate. Did it work? Not particularly. As we know everywhere, like if a community like that is disbanded, it kind of just moves to a more established sort of area. But at least if it's in permanent housing, they can't really do anything about that. So yeah, tradition.
I would like to thank you, thank Samantha, thank Markus, and thank you for this lively discussion. I think the topic is really fascinating, and there are many aspects, and the number of questions is proof of it. And it was the last Pariser Platz seminar before the summer. We will be back in September. Once again, many, many thanks.